Bienvenue à tous et à toutes à cette table ronde qui porte sur le travail et l'expérimentation institutionnelle. Est-ce que
Good morning, everyone. So we will talk about this better work. So we have four excellent presenters this morning who will reflect with us about these important, essential issues. And this is really brand from our group. We're trying to define what is better work and how the different stakeholders can use their resources and powers in order to do better work. So this morning, we are having a webinar. Therefore, you will need to ask your questions in written form. You have the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, so I will be able to address your questions later on. Actually, we asked four questions to our presenters, panel members this morning. First, we have Philippe Barré, who is a professor at the IR school at University of Montreal. Louise Boivin, who is at Université du Québec en Outaouais. Welcome, Louise. We have Dalia, Gesualdi-Fecteau from UQAM. And over the phone this morning, because apparently there's a power failure where she is, we have Urwana, Coiquaud, and you can hear us. Yes, I can. So we will proceed one question at a time, and each panel member will answer the four questions. And I remind you that you can also ask your questions in the Q&A section. So the first question, and I'm going to read it for the listeners. So the first question, by supporting yourself on a specific aspect of your research that you can indicate, what do you believe contributes to the improvement or to the deterioration of work? So for this first questions, perhaps we can start with Philippe. Yes, thank you, Mélanie, and good morning, everyone. So the cases of experimentation, and perhaps not only one object or one institution. So this will be based on several research projects on basically artists, professional artists in Quebec. So I've decided to tackle this time around, because we have only 2 minutes, I want to talk about the aspect of the deterioration of work, of the aspects of works, and perhaps not only deterioration, but why over time, let's say 10, 15 years, why the conditions, the social, economic conditions of artists have not improved over time, individually as well. Why over the career of an artist, their conditions, social, economic conditions have not improved. They start with a very low income, and at the end of the career, they end up with salary and conditions that have deteriorated since the time they've entered the labor market. So, of course, I would usually need at least 20 minutes to tell you about that, but we have to talk about the status, and my two colleagues might have things that are more interesting and, how can I say, more specific to say on that in terms of the legal framework, but what is supposed to protect artists. So, and this is not complete or perfect. The reason why, well, fundamentally, what stands out from this research program is what I've called the factors of becoming invisible, factors that create being invisible towards the work of artists. The essential component of this work appear to be invisible in terms of the law, and also in terms of public action. For example, I'm talking about the Arts Council, which is an organization that provides grants and subsidies. And the first factor of becoming invisible of their work, what we do not see when we think about the work of an artist, for example, the systemic component of their work or interaction. They're not isolated workers. Basically, they are dependent upon a series of other professionals, not only artists, but producers, art councils, and a series of stakeholders. The second factor that links to this invisibility, I believe that their precariousness, which stems from their activities being invisible, that very often is not well understood. And I will tell you a little more about that later on and what we mean by this. So work is very, needs to be flexible. And the third and last factor of being invisible are the principles of meaning, all the categories that are subjectives that artists themselves associate to their work. And that, I believe, is a factor of precariousness because notably, when we take a look at public action that is mobilized in favor of artists, so we don't understand where the focus is placed on, and everything that is related to the place of artists are things that I will discuss later on. We were asked to make just an introduction at this point in time. So these three factors of invisibility, or making the artist's invisibility of their work invisible, are factors of deterioration. There you go. Thank you. Dalia, will you take over?
Yes, thank you, Mélanie. Thank you for setting the stage. So my research focuses on different things, which is what are the obstacles and constraints that workers have with their access to protection. So I am, yes, indeed, a legal professional. And the question is how, with the labor code and labor work, can we protect workers? In this perspective, we want to think about this question of access to justice in a perspective of accessing justice. But I want to define that conceptually speaking, because I think this is where we need to think about how we can improve working conditions, but also issues of access related to labor law that can lead to deterioration of the conditions of work. So access to justice, three perspectives. We must look at, do the workers know the protections that are within their right? Do they adhere to this model? We're talking about labor law, and also how do we implement these principles of labor law? There's different groups who are excluded from this protection. There's also barriers of access, that formally they're not excluded, but there are issues in terms of knowledge, for instance, and also sometimes on the process side, there are barriers, and I'll get back to those. We talk about costs, but also human costs that these workers face. So why is this important in a perspective of improving or deteriorating the workplace? Well, labor law is susceptible when it is implemented. Like I said, this is susceptible to change conditions in terms of health or otherwise. It could also give more autonomy to workers and lead to more expressivity. The obstacles that we face, the obstacles that workers face, that is, formal barriers, and in terms of effective and actual barriers. These are prone to contribute to deterioration of work. For instance, when we have legal frameworks that restrict access, say to unionization, this is a classic example, right? So there are groups of workers that do not have access to unionizing. And also when workers are excluded from protections put in place with different acts and laws. Thank you. Thank you, Dalia. Urwana? Yes, so on this question, on my end, with some of my colleagues, we have approached this with digital platforms. Over the years, especially since 2014, Uber has fed the research and paved the way, because there are different aspects of its action that's highlighted in the way that they look at their working conditions, especially certain aspects of society can see deterioration. What we've observed is that digital platforms is something that is still vague. This was 7 years ago, and we've defined this as something institutional, or rather having an impact on institutions. Something that's called to really overhaul legal frameworks and replace these legal frameworks with other frameworks that fit with the business model, and an ideational entrepreneur. This is the last research we have on this, talking about the work on the political level to reach this goal. Digital platforms have greatly contributed to deterioration of work in certain sectors, especially cabs. I would say also that what we observe is not only a deterioration for workers, but also that there are concerns because we've had, laws in place for decades. Now we're moving to concerns about the consumer as opposed to the worker. The worker, discovers the considerable impact that these platforms have. These players saw this. It was developed on digital platforms. These used to be neutral players, right? So not only the worker has more risk, but it makes a difference on the quality of the work and on other aspects of the work. What we can also observe is a deterioration that is more concerning. That is the role of these platforms on the political scene. We see Uber acting in a more hidden way, politically speaking. They are transforming laws and institutional models and players in the field, leaving a watermark, and the whole society has to adapt to this business model. I will stop there for now. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. And now, last speaker, Louise Boivin. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mélanie, Philippe, Dalia, and Urwana for your remarks. I'm always looking at research in the same sectors. I'm focusing on care workers that do receive a salary. The research that I'm focusing on right now is done with Marilyn Deshaies at Laval University. She's a specialist of social work and community organizations. It's very interesting, as you'll see. So this joint work with industrial relations and the community sector is very, very interesting. So we're looking at two job categories, housekeeping attendant and nurse's aide. Most of them are women. There's a good bit of racialized women, also some people with a precarious immigration status. They could actually be irregular migrants or undocumented migrants. So this category is that what the Prime Minister called our guardian angels. So this is a paradox that the pandemic has highlighted for us. They were defined as guardian angels and essential workers. We talked about it a lot in the media, and the paradox is that they are silent. They don't have a collective voice. They don't have a group for advocacy in the private sector. We call them, auxiliaries or nurses' aide. They carry out essential work. A lot of these services are privatized with regards to care homes. So most services, like I said, are private. So they play an essential role, but they don't have a voice. Guardian angels here are being silent and devoting themselves, but they are not heard. So my research project looks at this. More specifically, we're looking at the relationship with collective representation for these care workers, paid care workers. We're really focusing on a comprehensive approach. And I'll get back to that a little bit later, but I want to look at two steps. Two first steps. So identifying the context, of course, of privatization for this work. There's a lot of structures for service delivery that we are looking at. There's a whole list. I won't tell you all about it, but there's all kinds of structures and there's practices also. We also have collective representation that do exist. There's very few, but there are a few that we need to identify. And this brings me to ask the question about this first block. What contributes to improving or deteriorating working conditions? Well, like Philippe said, I'll go straight to deterioration. I'm going to use actually part of what Dalia just presented. What contributes to deterioration of work is the inclusion that is implicit for regrouping and having collective representation. This is a concept from author Shepard about equality for freedom to regroup. There's a formal access, like we said, to labor law, but there's also the fact that even if the law gives you certain rights and freedoms, they don't necessarily take into account the way that businesses and services are structured. So home care service workers and nurses' aid have freedom of association. They have the right to unionize, etc. However, actually, they have no or very little protection. This is reflected in very low unionizing and also low effectiveness of rights when they are unionized. So in the very few cases where they are unionized, we look at their agreements and see what they can do, and they have very little on there. So they're under collective agreement, but I'll get to that later. What we see is 100% for both cases. In the public sector, 100% are not within associations, no unions. And in most private structures, there is no union either. With social economy business, we have about 20% where there is a union, but with very low effectiveness, with collective agreements that are not very robust. In the private sector, for home care workers or care home workers, especially for in the case of private senior care homes, a certain percentage gives, different services, nursing-related services, and only 16% are unionized, and we don't have any data on intermediary resources that are affiliated with private businesses. We don't have any data also on private non-under agreement organizations. So we call them guardian angels, and yet, what a paradox here. Thank you, Louise.
Ce cas-là nous amène tout naturellement vers.
I think this symposium, and our discussions lead us to the second question. This second question is about an example where the quality of the work became an issue as such. We see that there is a form of re-regulation or experimentation even with various sectors. So could you talk about some cases where the quality of the work became a core issue, how this evolved over time, and what was the outcome? You talked about deterioration of working conditions, so perhaps there will be other cases of improvement of working conditions. Let's switch the order. I'll start with Urwana. Yes, so for the second question, on our end, I'll talk about the taxi sector or the cab sector. So we see a deterioration, even though we do have to note that taxi drivers or cab drivers in Quebec were not considered salaried workers. Following the arrival of Uber on the scene, there were some changes. There are some hierarchy changes brought by this platform. We carried some work on a theoretical basis. We had 3 different timestamps. So the first time, so initial time, in the taxi industry, it's been regulated actually in the early 70s, and it focused on a framework relying on 3 elements. First, making sure that there is a certain quality in the taxi industry. So not only ensuring training for drivers, making sure that they have appropriate onboarding. I'm also looking for another word here, doing background checks, this kind of thing. So this is about quality. Second element, quantity, making sure that we have enough licenses so that there is a good number of taxi drivers in various cities. And people were actually putting themselves at risk because they were ready to jeopardize their own safety and that of others, right, to get a ride. The third question here, well, actually, I'll get back to that. So the second step was in 2014. Uber comes around, and then we get illegal competition because Uber entered the scene and did not take into account the laws and regulations in place. They just skipped over it. This, of course, led to lower income, lower use of services, and this led to the taxi licenses to have the value drawn down. Slowly, the government responded to this. So we deemed this as inappropriate competition. They wanted to open a window to Uber with unfair competition, and to adjust this, we had pilot projects renewed 3 times. And this was basically a space to experiment with regulation where we offer 2 new working conditions. Everyone is aware of the fact that we need to structure the industry, right? So these pilot projects meant that we were opening up a window for Uber, and these workers were working under different conditions, so different from conventional taxi drivers. Uber is now legalized, right, in their presence and activity. So, of course, over this time, Uber wanted to maintain its compliance. They also were able to buy some time. In the meantime, they got more and more clients and expanded their network to become really essential in the eyes of society. This is the second step where we are. And the interpreter apologizes. The audio quality being poor, interpretation is difficult. Il y a des comptes à rendre, on fait un constat, on fait un bilan à l'issue de cette expérimentation et ultérieurement, on peut recomposer les règles à la lumière de cette expérimentation. We can look at various rules and regulations and then adjust, but this is not what happened. Uber has private data, and so the government does not have a lot of data about Uber and about this specific market. So it is difficult after the fact to talk about an actual experiment. This pilot project will end once the new Quebec government will be elected. It was the CAQ, the CAC, who was very much willing to welcome Uber with open arms. A law was adopted and enacted where taxis were made to mostly disappear. It gave few privileges to conventional taxi drivers, but we welcome Uber. So the market has been completely overhauled by a private player here. This is the reason why we can observe whether taxi drivers will be compensated with public funds. About 3/4 of taxi drivers and owners of the value of their license that they used to have. This was typically their pension that was in this amount also. So we see unfair competition leading to regulatory experimentation, pilot projects, and then a redefining of the industry of taxi transportation. This all happened, with Uber. That's all for now. Thank you. Yes, we see this very well presented. Excellent. Perhaps we can move on to Louise for the evolution over time of your research. Yes, indeed, we're talking about taxi here, and I'm also looking at my first study time in the 70s. This is where we developed public services for home care. We also, this started beforehand, but we developed services and labor law. So there is an access to a collective representation, and it would be nice to look at this in the public and private sector. But I had to focus on the private market in my research. So in the 70s, we de-institutionalized care of seniors and handicapped people. So we want to develop home care services or smaller care homes. We also have the feminist movement stimulating the development of public services. In this context, there's also a program for training for the two jobs that I'm looking at. So there's a start of actually bringing down what was just done. We dismantle it. In the 90s, there's a deterioration of working conditions in public organizations, and in parallel, a development of a private sector with very precarious jobs as compared to what we see in the public sector, even if there's some precariousness there. It's in this context that I was talking about exclusion. So we have this freedom of association. And so in both the private and the public sector, there is a deterioration of working conditions. In that period of time, there is an attempt of association. This was the organization for private senior care homes. This happened in 2016 and 17. There was a strike, a coordinated strike. So when collective bargaining was carried out on an organization base, there was an attempt to coordinate the bargaining, and it did not work out because there was different constraints, but there was a strike. So in several regions of Quebec, there was the strike. It was a 6-week strike. It was organized by a union affiliated with the FTQ. This was the start of an institutional experimentation, sort of. From this point on, there was a proposal to look at a law about collective agreements that we wanted to expand. So expand the application or implementation of this collective agreement to all the sector for long-term senior care homes. This was a proposal. It was adopted by the organization. And then we get to our second phase, starting with the pandemic. The sector that I'm studying, so long-term care homes, mostly for seniors, and home support. This is at the core of the issue. There are outbreaks, COVID-19 outbreaks. There are very difficult situations where there's inquiries in several private care homes. And so at this point, we see some increases in pay, mostly temporary, and they are announced by the government, and it does not fix at all the quality of working conditions, and it does not fix the issue about lack of access to collective representation. In this context, there is a willingness to have an institutional change. We see this from the union and from the CSQ. There's protests to look at this program so that the law be implemented and that the collective agreement be expanded to the private sector and also to home care.
So this includes private agencies, even freelancers in this sector, as well as the private sector, which you have the private homes, the CHSLD, intermediary homes or care. So the issues are not, or the challenges are not the same, depending on the stakeholders, because you don't have the same type of investors, depending on the sector. But despite all of this, and what this raises in terms of questions, well, actually, it raises several questions. For example, questions of alliances between unions and user groups, because they're representatives for people living with handicaps who have spoken out about the decree of collective agreement for home care. But this actually doesn't answer the question of access to collective representation on the field of the different sectors. So I'll come back later on and share with you other elements about the research and on this sociological aspect, what we need to do in order to try and find solutions. Well, thank you very much, Louise. Philippe. Thank you. Well, in the case of experimentations, once again, I will talk about artists and the career of artists and what we've studied in a team from many colleagues from l'école, Laurence Dubuc, Ian MacDonald, and colleagues from University Laval as well. So earlier, I gave you those aspects or zones of invisibility. And in the artistic world, the career is marked by many uncertainties. And this creates a certain number of problems that leads to exiting these careers or professions. And very often there are very strict limits between the professional artists and non-professional artists. And this is marked by a series, once again, of obstacles to entry. And one of the barriers to entry is that these careers start when the artist is very young, in the dance or circus, in many of these performing arts. So very often you have, for example, the circus schools who will recruit students when they're children. It starts at the age of 12. I believe the same thing for ballet schools. So the selection mechanisms are very specific and very early. The selection process at the entry of the labor force. So after having completed their schools, and will give only a few the access to the work market, the labor market, and there's the notion of appreciation of talent, which will provide them with more opportunities. And these are based on institutionalized mechanism. And the last thing for this professionalization, there are processes as well that are very institutionalized, codified to access to funding. So we find ourselves with a labor force that is really very professionalized. We compare artists to athletes, professional athletes, Olympic athletes, and despite it all, their careers are very uncertain. And it is very uncertain, as I've said, including for the small minority, I should say, of artists who have the better protected and the better compensated jobs at one time. Perhaps they will have an illness, an accident, or will be laid off. The contracts will perhaps be a one-year contract. So all of these can actually be dangerous for their career. And the case that I want to present is also marked by three things, or three stages. I have 1, 2, and 3. The case is quite interesting because it comes from, the base. Dance artists who have put in place a mechanism that has developed over time, and it helps artists to establish a transition, a career transition, so that they can prepare to enter other types of professions. So a transition of career, because before the 1980s, there was nothing in terms of career transition. For example, in the 1980s, many things were accompanying the athletes, but not artists. So in Toronto, this was implemented by a past dancer from DTRC. And this is a transition center for artists and dancers, I should say, and I can give you some information about how it's subsidized. Actually, there's a public funding and donations, but there's an implementation of this support for dancers So what they've implemented is an individualized support, customized one for artists and by artists. Also individual consultations with advisors, career advisors, psychological professional, legal advisors, and also there's a scholarship process that is provided for skill development, a return to school, etc. And those are all processes that are also implemented for access to these scholarships. So this is in 1985. At the CRTD, there's the head office in Toronto. There's one in Vancouver, and the third is in Montreal. And I will speak mostly about the Montreal office. Now, second component, and I will focus on the CRTD in Montreal. We saw an expansion of the mission and of the action of the CRTD. First, for the dancers, artists stemming from dance, and this was in relations with CNESST that ask for workers' compensation and CRTD, more specifically in Quebec, because it's the equivalent. Well, there's no institutionalized equivalent in the other provinces. So here we're talking about transition resources in Quebec that provide, let's say, a legal accompaniment. So they accompany the dancers in their request for compensation and the CRTD, because right now we're talking about institutionalized experimentation. And this brings the CNESST to move from compensation to transition, professional transition of artists for performing arts, not simply because they've injured themselves or because they will no longer be able to go back on stage, but so that they can use this indemnization so that they can do other things. So here we're seeing a change in paradigm. And the other type of expansion implemented by CRTD is towards other artists, not from dance, but from other performing arts, circus, theater, and music. So they've implemented a pilot project to expand the services to other performing arts. So third component, and I didn't date the second component, but we can certainly come back to that later on. But the third stage is very recent, and despite what the pandemic has created, we're experiencing very interesting thing, because this crisis, this health crisis, recent crisis, which led to a pause of the artists. So we saw that the CRTD was there, and it expanded its action and offers, not only to other performing artists other than dancers, but also to a series of other artists than the artists that were the focus in the beginning. For example, artists that are at the end of their career, and in their case, it can be in their 30s, and the CRTD is expanding their service offers to younger professionals as soon as they enter the market. All this to say that they provided new services. Also, in this third component and expansions, and once again, we have very interesting institutionalized dynamics. We know that it goes over, the borders of the CRTDs and other large institutions in this sector. Those representing performing arts are now considering the transition, career transition, as an important issue, a political issue, and are aiming to implement strategies. So basically, it's a sort of common action which mobilizes this sector. And the last element, this recent research, we've also noticed that there's an expansion as well of not only the transition, but we saw new artist groups. So Philippe is saying that unfortunately I have an unstable internet connection, so I hope that you can still hear me. So here we're talking about new artistic organizations that are created and that break away from past logics as well. In terms of governance, we no longer have, for example, those choreographs that have only one at the top, but we have several choreographs working together. We see mechanisms of sharing resources, installations, for example, in order to attract in part resources that are limited because of the context of the pandemic, but they aim for a new democratic sharing of resources, whether installations or other types of resources. There it is for now. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Philippe. Very interesting, and it stands out from the other two cases that we've heard, because right now we're talking about initiatives of artists at the local level, artists that organize themselves. So thank you very much, Philippe. And we will conclude the second question with Dalia. Well, the privilege of being the last one to speak is that I can base myself on what my colleagues have already said. I would like to add an example and how the sectoral or activity models help workers produce different models. And this stems from a research in a sector that is not very well known. This is actually in forestry. And this is the management of our forests, where you have commercial activities. It requires cuts, but of course replanting forests. So here we're talking about non-commercial activities in forestry. It's research with UQAM from UQAM and Témiscamingue, and Béatrice Ben, who also studies the indigenous workers. I'd like to thank Claude Rioux, who is with us today, and he really inspired me in this research. So I would like to mention his support. And what I would like to mention is an institutional that actually improved working conditions. And this is an unexpected result from our research, but it's structured the way that we saw things. So maybe a little context: in Quebec, 90% of forest is public, so it belongs to you and I, and this is a little bit how we see things, but it's more or less true. We can come back to that later on, but the forest is public, therefore it is managed by different institutions under, of course, the state. That's the main difference. So what is forestry? Well, you have the workers who plant trees, who make sure that there is a good management of forest so that it can be productive. It is done in remote areas very often. It is a seasonal work. The hours of work are very, very long. And of course, it's considered a high risk by this Université because there are risks of professional illness and injuries. Unionization is limited in this area, and this is why I was very interested by this, because there's a diversity of labor that is spectacular. You have labor or workers in an inter-regional, inter-provincial, or you have foreign temporary workers that come from different programs. So there's a coexisting, really a diversity in terms of the status of jobs in this area. And they also live in forestry camps, so they work and live in the same area, and they go back to their homes more or less on a regular basis, depending on where the forestry camps are situated. So what is interesting and what brought about the re-regulation of work, and I would also like to mention a change in paradigm that occurred in the Quebec forestry. In 2003 was implemented the new forestry regime. And this new forestry regime replaced the commercial operation plan for forest that was in place since the 1980s. And when we talk about the movie Erreur Boréale, this talked about the different type of poor management of forestry. So here we cut down trees to produce lumber, paper, etc. But then how do we manage forestry? Before 2003, what you have to understand is that it was companies who were commercially operating that had the duty to replant, and therefore several stakeholders talked about the reality, and this is why we had a new regime in 2003. So then we divided up the commercial and non-commercial activities. So the non-commercial activity, replanting, management, and non-commercial management of forestry, and the contracts are given to companies, but also to cooperatives or co-ops. And there's a diversity of companies in this sector. And that's also very, very interesting because they're indigenous communities that are organized in order to obtain contracts from the government, and therefore there's a government management of these contracts given to stakeholders that are ex-forêt, who work in tender bid or direct contracts with these co-ops, for example. So I know this was a long explanation, but it led to a phenomena of the re-regulation. And it's very interesting in terms of the functions of labor law. Why? Because the companies amongst themselves realize that competition between companies was done on the poor working conditions. So when you talk about the conditions, of course, we also think about the rights that to protect, and there's another function, which is to regulate the competition conditions. So here we are at the heart of this. because some companies are saying, well, they're competing based on poor working conditions for the workers. So basically, there was a distortion of the conditions in terms of competition. So what occurred starting in 2004? Well, the sectoral association, where you have a silviculture association and others, have come together and have asked the standardization bureau to establish a certification for this sector, which involved that every companies and co-ops needed to abide by a certain standard, and if not, they could not obtain contracts from the government. So of course, this is fundamental. If these companies are not certified, or after an inspection during the season lose their certification, they can no longer obtain contracts. And of course, this would mean the end of their activities, or almost, since 90% of forest is public. So there's a certification managed by a third party to the legal regulation, and all the companies must obtain this certification. And when we read the standards and the rights in this certification, essentially around health and safety, occupational health and safety, and working conditions needed to be transparent so that they know exactly what the conditions are, what the wages were, because the workers had the status of being salaried workers, but actually it looked more like freelancers because they're paid based on production, and they manage their traveling, and also they have to pay the costs linked to their tools. So here we are not seeing clear standards, linked to collective agreements. These are not new norms, but basically revitalizations of standards because of the absence of institutions that ensure rights, for example, chercheur-e-s, because they were not very mobilized. So what happened with this standard is that, and there's another side to this, but it doesn't allow the active mobilization of rights by workers in a perspective of bottom up. It's more top down, because the stakeholder, Bureau de normalisation du Québec, will make audits. Of course, there's a variation from one company to the next in the type of audits made, but we will try to see if there's personal protection equipment, if there's training on health and safety for workers, what is the quality of the forestry camp, is there potable water, drinking water, because that is an issue in these camps. So very interesting, and it's not necessarily through active mobilization, as we say in English, complaint driven, but here we have a third party who will intervene and through an audit system will ensure of the compliance of a certain threshold of rights. So have this changed, revolutionized anything? Well, we have to say no. But what the workers have told us, because when we went on the field, in the field, I should say, to observe the conditions, in which the workers were, I can tell you that there's an incredible quantity of flies, whatever the season, and all the workers have said that this standard that was implemented more effectively was linked to health and safety. Why? Because the workers in this sector can have heat strokes. They work under the sun all day, or they can face a bear. This is very unusual. Or they could be stung by bees. They're faced with several types of risk, and these people work on the lot alone. And if something happens, it is possible that no one will find them before a certain time. And therefore, this certification has created a change in the prevention of risks by the implementation of strategies of mode action, so that there's a better protection of occupational health and safety of workers. So that side is very interesting. But this certification did not change all of the complaints from workers in terms of the decrease in wages they've experienced over the years, because their wages stabilized, and the workers have to pay for the purchase of their tools, travel. So there was even a decrease in salaries. So this standards does not regulate the financial aspect of the work, but other normative conditions, occupational health and safety. So interesting, in the last comment I would make, what is interesting or concerning is that faced with this certification, and because of the presence of these audits performed, we can ask where are the stakeholders, CNES, for example, who were responsible for, imposing these rights. Well, they're almost absent because of where the companies are located and where the work is performed. And also, we weren't able to measure this, but there's clearly a delegation that was done towards the standardization office in Quebec to establish a certain threshold of rights, but there's almost an absence of inspectors in this sector. But other things, and we can come back to this later on, despite the important complaints of the workers in this sector, the rate of unionization is extremely low in this sector. So I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you for this overview. Thank you for all these cases where there are positive and negative outcomes, both. So let me remind you that if you have any questions for our panelists, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. You're welcome to think about your questions. I'll try to keep a moment at the end of the roundtable so that we can get back to these questions. Now we're moving to the last section. We want to make sure that we cover everything we set out to cover. So we've developed a common or shared framework, a template, to try to understand how we will have institutional experimentation and to understand the work, the quality of the work that is ongoing. This framework allows us to have shared reflection. So from this analysis framework, could you tell us how we should conceive good or poor working conditions? Which factors should be considered in order to better understand work quality, and perhaps insert in your answer the key points for our shared reflection? So what would be the essential points here to think about? Let's start with Louise. Okay, so I will break the ice then. I'm just going fast, but let me give a bit of background, even though I have just 2 minutes. The coordinated strike in senior private long-term care homes. In 2016-17, it was in about 40 residences. And this went along with the movement for getting $15 per hour. There were very low gains. The idea was to ask for a plan related to the Act Respecting Collective Agreement decrees in the context of the pandemic. In this context, the manpower shortage was exacerbated. I don't need to go over that. We all are aware. So there was this demand, but that was not really met. In several countries, we see mobilizations of civil society. There's different groups asking for change. But it does not fix the whole concept of collective or group representation. They're mostly women. So to answer the question, what would be the key points to look at in order to improve work? I think we need a multidisciplinary approach. We need to have a look at access to labor law, also the right to equality. There is a great proportion of BIPOC women and migrants also. So even when we see in various sectors some union claims, we still have this issue of collective representation. So perhaps a collective agreement could be expanded to all the sector in order to improve working conditions and pay and other things. This is important, but still there is no collective voice for these workers in this context. They would not necessarily get unionized in the workplace in that context. This brings us back to an issue. We want to see how this can be constructed. And I think Philippe said some very interesting remarks. What I've decided to do in this slide with my colleague is to see, and I don't have any results yet to present to you, but we want to have an approach based on the experience of workers. There is solidarity, there is resistance, also sometimes with other actors, social actors, or with natural caregivers and other players, and also within the workers' groups themselves. So we want to take a grassroots approach, look at the people concerned and look at their social practices to see what already exists. With social media, for instance, there are Facebook groups that exist, and these are forums that we need to take into account, because perhaps it doesn't fit with the traditional collective group representation, but still we have the foundations for other types of organizations or other types of advocacy work. This is what we want to look at. So this is a comprehensive approach. It starts from the grassroots, from the workers themselves. This goes beyond state or union or even community organization frameworks. We can study, like we said, community groups. We see support from one group or another group, for instance. But this type of alliance is around the lowest common denominator, which is manpower shortage. This is an issue that we want to resolve, essentially, by increasing pay. This is where effective and actual access to labor law comes in. So an alliance around the lowest common denominator does not resolve improving working conditions necessarily, but yeah, this is where we're just going back to the basics, and I'll let you know how this goes. Thank you, Louise. Philippe, would you like to continue? Yes, I'll try to be brief as well. I very much agree on this, on what you're saying. So how should we design definitions of good and poor work? There is no good or decent work without players and stakeholders playing a role. As researchers, I think we need to look at decent work or quality work according to categories. These are the categories that people themselves give to their work, the meaning they give to their work. And of course, this is very manifest, but I think this is a heuristic approach. This is also specific to institutionalization designs. So for instance, the concept of precariousness, it's a core concept, but artists never refer to that. They will talk about the lack of consistency. They talk about volatility, but they don't talk about precariousness of their working conditions. So I think with our conceptual matrix with institutional experimentation, we look at reducing economic and social risks. We look at questions of independence and control over the work. But there's also expression in the workplace. So expressiveness can take many different shapes, but work within the society, Dalia, you mentioned this, with forest workers. Yes, when you're in the woods in a very remote area, what voice do you have? Can you express yourself? This labor is just ignored, invisible. Same thing with performing arts. I think we're looking here at a whole series of categories that are not always, fitting with where researchers think it is. Recognition of, for instance, artistic work. It may be different from what researchers think. And even institutional stakeholders in arts, for instance, they believe career transition is exiting this occupation. And our work shows that artists, well, some know that for various reasons, their physical, their health condition may have to stop this occupation, but do they want to? Not necessarily. So it is very subjective. It's the meaning that people give their own work. This is a very powerful approach. I talked about the status of being an artist and versus the reality of their work, and also public action and the actual needs and issues. Let me wrap up. Last question. What are the takeaways about institutional experimentation? I think we shouldn't underestimate the differences of the various workplaces we are studying. They are highly heterogeneous workplaces. It varies. With dance, we see 75% of women, for instance. So these are segmented groups. They face issues sometimes that are paradoxical. I think we need to take into account the multiple networks and multiple issues and not see this as a homogeneous set of conditions. When we talk about precariousness, it's not only economic and financial. There are multiple aspects to this precariousness related to many other different things. So we need to take all of this diversity into account and not oversimplify this with one or two factors. Thank you, Philippe. So before we move on to Urwana, we have a comment from a participant. So from what Philippe and Louise mentioned, it seems that we need to look at expression in the workplace. Gregor says, if we look at China and Vietnam, any claims made by unions don't go over so well. So yes, there's web chat, Facebook, etc. So as a researcher, I think we are really faced with a necessity to tweak our approach to really reach out to these forms of expression that are, shaped differently, for instance, with social media. We have 15 minutes left at this point. So Urwana first and then Dalia. And if you have questions, please let us know and I will relay your questions. Thank you, Mélanie. Thank you for all panelists. I think, indeed, expressiveness in the workplace is quite important. It allows us to look at different things such as autonomy, control over work. So I think it's a sum, right? And this is a bit paradoxical, but it seems like it's a circular movement of sorts. With the case of the experimentation that my colleagues and I have looked in the taxi industry, we've been observing digital platforms. Uber, to me, is a funny beast, and we only know part of their activity. And still, it is a stakeholder, a major stakeholder in our economy. Expansion occurs depending on the data. And typically, the data is collected in a very sophisticated manner, in a way unbeknownst to us. This used to be government data that was used to define parameters, but now the state lacks all this data. I'll get back to this third question. Let me talk briefly about socioeconomic risks. So first, of course, Uber drivers are exposed to greater risks. We have quality control, control also of the quantity of driver licenses, and also a regulation of prices so that pricing is fair and constant. But all of this exploded with Uber. And Uber said, well, we're not professional drivers. We do this perhaps over the weekend. And this is what was presented at the Legislative Assembly. As such, this justified the fact that these partners or these drivers don't fall under this regulatory framework. What we see globally is deprofessionalization. All matters related to quality, training, all of this went out the window or was very much reduced. And again, we didn't specifically study working conditions for Uber drivers. We looked at regulatory action about the advent of Uber. So we cannot draw very robust conclusions about these aspects. But what we did see related to jurisprudence is work tool being the car, and that is not provided by the employer. So the driver bears all the risks. They make sure that they have an insurance if there should be an accident and such. So the income with this temporary activity or this very ad hoc activity versus the costs for operating this cab driving activity, well, this is calculation that is really very rational. Since we modified the number of taxi driver licenses, we see a change in taxi drivers waiting for rides for longer. We can infer, therefore, that this impacts their family life. I mentioned it also earlier. There's an algorithm that was seen as neutral. But with this algorithm, we have a hierarchy, and even more so than the conventional taxi driver business. This algorithm fosters more of this legal subordination. As citizens, we need to underscore this. The algorithm looks at a lot of data, captures a lot of data. It is very unique. Another point about work and control. Isabelle Marcin made this observation when we looked at agreements. The famous clauses within these agreements make it difficult. Another point about expressiveness. So beyond the arbitration clause, the social representation of a taxi driver has definitely evolved. It is no longer seen as an actual professional occupation. We also have a whole society impact around this. I was talking about Uber as a political stakeholder. This is a major concern. And social issues such as sustainable development, everything also related. Actually, Uber said that they're a solution to traffic congestion, but we're not quite sure that this is the case. And many studies show that it's actually the opposite. Many people forfeit collective transportation and choose Uber. Now, for some takeaways, the longitudinal analysis was especially relevant in our case, at least for ideas and to get the lingo. What was said at the National Assembly? How can we see how the sector is regulated? I think this is very important. Also, the multidisciplinary aspect. At first, I was going at it with a very legal lens, but then I got interested in the policy and political side of this more, and even on the human aspect as well. There's also an international aspect. Uber is, of course, a worldwide organization, and we have different models depending on each locale. It's really important to look at these and compare. This is how we're going to know a little bit more how Uber behaves. Thank you. All right, so now on to Dalia. You can wrap up. We have only a few minutes left. Yes, so very quickly. With this global question of asking how labor law is prone to improving working conditions, I think a takeaway is that we need to be aware of the architecture of regulation and coexistence of different systems. There are impacts of the fact that labor law and labor frameworks are very segmented. To give you an example, we have standards, for instance, regarding psychological harassment. This led to more legal involvement for how these rights are implemented. So I think we need to have a look at this structure of labor law to understand the impacts of it in a very local context. Second, cross-cutting takeaway. Again, as a legal expert, I think we're going to have to transcend internal analysis with regards to labor law. Improving or deterioration of working conditions depends on several stakeholders. When we talk about migrants, for instance, we have to think about not only regulatory frameworks, about law and labor law. We have to go beyond this and look at regulatory frameworks related to immigration. Another example, and I think Urwana has a lot of other examples about this, the right to work and social protection. So if we look at forestry workers, these workers make sure that they work a certain number of hours in order to have access to job insurance. And this will determine everything about their job. So we can't just think internally, but about all the effects of these norms and how effective they are. And I'll stop there. Yes, thank you very much. Norms and standards that we have in order to assess the quality of work needs to be redefined. We don't necessarily talk about precariousness, but we see diverse forms of security offered to workers, and this justifies the quality of work, whether physical or financial security. We see that there's different actions, not necessarily standard or conventional one, but collective action that allow for protection of autonomy and getting better control over work or work transition. These observations show us that there are new forms of expressiveness that we need to take into account as researchers. And you've really underscored this very well. We need to use different approaches in order to reach out and have data about this expressiveness in all its shapes and forms. We have just a minute left. There is a question from our participant. I think it's a great question for wrapping up. The question is, well, first, we thank you for your comments. And if you had just one working condition to change so that we could improve working conditions, what would this one parameter be? Oh, me again first. Well, I think the main issue here, equality with regards to collective representation. We see this with the Black Lives Matter movement. The fourth or fifth feminist movement also shows this equality in access to a collective voice. If it doesn't get seen in the workplace, then it will be outside of the workplace. Thank you, Louise. Urwana? I could say several things, but I'm thinking of the waiting times. This is, I think, the main issue today in several occupations, actually. So today, businesses look at this waiting time. We have this risk, and we need to look at other mechanisms for this. Yeah. So for artists who are freelancers, most of them want access to the right to work or access to a status that allows them to have equivalent protection to that of salaried workers.
Merci beaucoup. Finalement, Dalia?
Thank you. And Dalia? I think it would be standards regarding the duration of work. We see extension of work in several sectors. The workload is ever increasing. So the question is, with increasing duration of work and with how it becomes more difficult to plan work, we see workers facing various risks. Collective expressiveness can be restricted by work time expanding. So I think we're going to have a look at work duration, especially in these periods where there is no work. Great. So thank you so much to all our panelists. There will be a second roundtable at 10:45. This will be held in English, but there will be simultaneous interpretation. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for participating. Thank you for all your questions, and I will see you in a short while. Thank you.